My good shepherd brings me all. You are all I need. You let me catch my breath, even in the valley of death. You are all.
Hey everybody, welcome to Verse by Verse Bible Teaching. My name is Chris.
And this is Mike.
And today we're going to be finishing up the book of Galatians. For the rest of the book of Galatians, you can go to our website, which is versebyversebibleteaching.com, and check out all the archives. And so we're just going to go ahead and get started. Mike, you want to get us started?
Yep. Now, we've looked at Galatians here, and then in the last, 8 or 9 verses here, what we're going to see is Paul sort of wrapping things up. He actually gives 2 final benedictions, one of prayer and one of, grace off the top of my head, in verse 16 and verse, 18 respectively. And there's some really great kernels of knowledge that we can glean there, including one where one little phrase that kind of, really surmises the whole book of Galatians nicely into one little phrase. Not even really a sentence, just one little phrase. So with that, let's just jump in there. That's Galatians chapter 6, verse 11. See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. Now this gets back to something that we've talked a little bit about here in this series, which is Paul's thorn in the flesh. Many think that Paul's thorn in the flesh was a type of malaria common to that area called Oriental ophthalmia. And they point to this verse to try to buoy their position. Still others think that it might have been depression or some other physical ailment. Whatever the physical manifestation is of this thorn, Paul is clear in 2 Corinthians that the source of that is a messenger of Satan. He says, 2 Corinthians, so to keep me from being conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being conceited. We might think of this as a 2-layered problem, if you will. The messenger of Satan, the spiritual layer, was there to keep Paul weak through a physical problem, which would be the second layer. Now, with this in mind, let's stop and think about the larger ramifications for a second, especially with verse 11 here in view of chapter 6 in Galatians. Paul writes that he is writing with large letters to the Galatians to show them it is him, that they would somehow recognize this. Now, really, the most interesting thing on this is, through whatever this weakness is, they know that it is him somehow. Now, there's an important point there, because through the backdrop of Paul's human weakness, this becomes the ideal canvas for God to show his divine attributes. So he alone can be praised. Paul is weak, and so only God can be doing these things. Paul's weakness was the backdrop in which God displayed his divine qualities here. And that's why Paul writes here in verse 11, see with what large letters I am writing to you with mine own hand.
Well, that's really good, man. It's like you're really getting to the heart of the matter there. And I would agree with you, too, on this whole last part of these verses in Galatians. It seems like Paul is giving us a lot of gems that we can really use. It's sort of like the last words are really helpful. But it starts off with this verse here. It's kind of, as you mentioned, sort of a strange verse. See how large a letter I have written unto you with mine own hand. And I've always thought, too, and I still do, that this probably is referring to his thorn in the flesh, which I think is a good possibility of being an eye problem of some sort. From this verse and other verses, especially here in Galatians. But there is a lot of speculation, not only in regards to that particular issue, but why he was right. I mean, some other people have other ideas why he's making that known. Look how large of a letter I've written with you in my own hand. Some would argue, why is he bringing it to their attention? And also there's another kind of part that I've wondered myself about this is, where do people get the idea that, because the general idea is that that Paul was writing this letter with an amanuensis, some hired writer, and that Paul sort of took the pen from his hand at this point and then began to write this last paragraph, as opposed to either signing it himself or you could even really get, and the commentary in which Calvin writes suggests that he wrote the entire letter himself, so there's some sort of dispute about that. So there's kind of a lot going on here. I'm going to quote two commentators on it. One says, this is Matthew Henry, originally Paul added only his signature to the letter, which the scribe wrote to his dictation. But in this case, his heart is running over with such love and anxiety for the Galatians that he writes this whole last paragraph. See, he says, in what large letters I am writing in my own handwriting. The large letters may be due to three things. A, this paragraph may be written in large because of its importance, as if it were printed in heavy type. B, it may be written large because Paul was unused to wielding a pen, and it is the best that he could do. Or C, it may be that Paul's eyes were weak, or that the blinding headache was on him, and all he could produce was large, sprawling handwriting or of a man who can hardly see. Another one that I thought was particularly insightful was David Guzik, who says other examples of this postscript are in 1 Corinthians, where he says, the salutation with mine own hand, and Colossians 4, chapter 4, verse 18, this salutation by my own hand. So these are two places where he actually talks about pointing that he's writing the last part. One reason Paul may have done this was to prove that he really wrote the letter, as is reflected in 2 Thessalonians 3:17, where it says, the salutation of Paul with mine own hand, which is a sign in every epistle, so I write. So I feel like that this last paragraph, it's the last paragraph that was written by Paul and by his own hand, and not the whole letter, and that it was large letters for emphasis and possibly for verification that it was him and not some forgery. Possibly that validation is because he had bad eyesight. Look at these large letters. You guys know about that problem that I have. This is also proving that that this is me. So it's probably a combination of things that I think we'll find a lot in these sort of enigmatic phrases.
He didn't give them like a credit card number or RFID chip scan.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. I scan. Galatians chapter 6, verse 12. It is those who want to make a good showing in the flesh who would force you to be circumcised, and only in order that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. Now this relates back to our point earlier in the previous verse. Paul, through various passages of the New Testament, seems to understand that God in His glory was indeed glorified against the backdrop of human weakness. Now with that in mind, it's interesting to note here that Paul says that those who oppose him are wanting to make a good showing in the flesh, because for Paul, the flesh is perhaps better weak for God to work. And I think of the martyrs that have suffered historically horribly in the flesh for God. Those who were tortured for Christ. They were burned, beaten, stabbed, gutted, kicked, spat upon, and killed all the day long. Polycarp, an early church father, went to be burned at the stake, and all he had to do to get out of that punishment was renounce his faith. These martyrs were not interested in making a good showing in the flesh. It also says here that those who would force you to be circumcised. Now this again is interesting. God never forces those into His kingdom. God gave us a beautiful and terrible gift called free will. If your theology is similar to mine, the choice to walk into God's kingdom is one of a free will choice. This isn't something where God, just pushes you in. Finally, Paul mentions here that they are doing all this to escape the persecution of the cross of Christ. As I've mentioned before in this Bible study, this is something that we are a bit immune to here in the United States. In this country, it costs very little to walk into Jesus' kingdom, though it may cost much more in subtle ways to truly follow Him. Following Jesus usually involves a complete shift, sometimes where one is persecuted, as Paul says in the Corinthians letters, that he was persecuted all the day long. That these people are escaping the persecution of the cross is interesting as well, because historically, the men of God, both Old Testament and New Testament, have always been persecuted. Tradition holds that Jeremiah was eventually sawed in half. So for the Galatian believers, it is those who want to make a good showing in the flesh who would force you to be circumcised. and only in order that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. Chris?
And what about Isaiah? How did he end up going out?
I don't remember.
Probably wasn't pretty.
No, I'm sure it was bad.
Okay. Galatians 6:12, as many as desire to make a fair show in the flesh, they constrain you to be circumcised, only lest they should suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. So Paul is making some final statements about these false teachers. So he's going to wrap it up and just kind of talk about these false teachers who had been leading the Galatians astray with their legalistic false teaching. Paul seems to know a good deal about the personality and intent of these teachers here, even if this knowledge is only inferred in a general way, sort of knowing the general attitude of legalistic false teachers, of which Paul probably had seen a few. But it could mean that he did know about them and knew that they were trying to make a fair show in the flesh, or knew a little bit more about them, as we might see here just a little bit in the next verse. He implies that one of the reasons that they desire for them to be circumcised is for protection from persecution. And this is possibly because the Romans accepted Judaism as a religion, and therefore it had its own protections. Matthew Henry says, it would save them from persecution. The Romans recognized the Jewish religion and officially allowed Jews to practice it. Circumcision was an unanswerable mark of a Jew. So these people saw it as a passport to safety should persecution arise. Circumcision would keep them safe from the hatred of Jews and the law of Rome alike. So it was a very tough time for these Christians. Persecution pretty much at every turn. And in fact, for hundreds of years after this too, as you mentioned. But first, at this time, it was primarily by the Jews and starting to be by the Romans. And so this was, there would be calls for them to deny Christ, as you mentioned too. That's all they had to do to save their lives and their spouses and their children. And actually, interestingly, the Bible says that those times are returning. In Matthew 24, verse 9, it says, then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. So there is a pretty cryptic prophecy from our Lord there about this type of thing happening again. He goes on to say that it's going to be so great that children are going to be delivering up their parents for this type of persecution. So we should learn the secret of those martyrs like Polycarp that you mentioned, which sang to their deaths. It's because of the joy of Christ, and really getting into that is a great book. Fox's Book of Martyrs, a pretty classic book if you've never read it. I have an online version of it for free that you can download and listen to, but it's certainly not a very expensive book to get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. So many people today really forget the idea of how much people have suffered for their beliefs. That's something that's really almost forgotten by most people who sit in church today, and certainly by people who don't identify as Christians. Galatians chapter 6, verse 13. For even those who are circumcised do not themselves keep the law, but they desire to have you circumcised, that they may boast in your flesh. So the idea of the law is developed previously in the book of Galatians. A schoolmaster, a judge, etc. is just a little bit in view here. And we'll start from there to sort of add explanatory value and tie this into the whole rest of the book. The whole point of the law was to teach us that we can't get to God by our own works. Now, God's standard, if you will, is perfection. So to be good before God in the law is to keep it perfectly. And the Judaizers of the day, Paul speaks of here, couldn't do that. Simply put, for many reasons, one of which is because no one can. Even ultra-Orthodox Jews say that. Nobody can keep the law perfectly. Even those who are circumcised do not themselves keep the law. But the offending group Paul is speaking of here actually gets a little worse in the second half of this verse.